Hello students, today we will discuss an important but controversial topic called terrorism. Terrorism is called controversial because there is a lot of politicization over the issue, and it is also controversial because one country's terrorist is called another country's freedom fighters, and also there is no agreed definition on terrorism, and that is the reason why global counter-terrorism efforts have become ineffective. We will cover the issue of terrorism in two lectures. In the first lecture, we will discuss about the general understanding about terrorism, particularly the definitional problem, the core elements associated with terrorism, and different kinds of strategies used by the terrorists to achieve their political objectives. In the second lecture, we will discuss about various theoretical perspective on the issue of terrorism, and then what are the counter-terrorism methods widely used by different countries in the world, and we will also cover some of the important effects of the 9/11 terrorist attack on the United States and how that changed the whole discourse on terrorism, the whole understanding on the issue of terrorism. So let us start with our first lecture, that is the conceptual understanding of terrorism. Let us now discuss about the background of the issue of terrorism. As I said, terrorism is highly controversial term because there is a definitional problem that nobody accepts the other's definition of terrorism, and also there is no clear cut strategy how the international community should use to address the issue of terrorism or contain the problem of terrorism. After decades of being used by politicians and rulers in public discourses and legislation, the term still lacks a precise definition. The United Nations General Assembly, for instance, discussed international terrorism that lasted for a whole week in October 2001, but there is no precise definition that could be agreed upon. A scholar has compiled about 250 definitions of terrorism, and the US government alone uses 20 definitions of terrorism. You just can imagine that different countries have different understanding of terrorism, and in the absence of an internationally agreed definition, each country has incorporated its own particular definition of terrorism into its domestic law, which has serious implications for its criminal justice system or justice administration system in general. If you don't agree on a particular kind of definition, so in that case either you treat the terrorists as ordinary criminals or you treat them as prisoners of war. So both are different and both require different kinds of law to deal with. So it is therefore very important that we should have an agreed definition of terrorism, and that will help not only the countries concerned but also the approach of international community in dealing with the problem of terrorism. The problem is that what looks like terrorism is not the same for everyone. Terrorism is a highly pejorative term that stigmatizes those to whom it is successfully applied, demonizing and delegitimizing one's conduct as immoral and illegitimate, just like terms like murderer or rapist. So basically it is a pejorative term in the sense that it stigmatizes and delegitimizes the use of violence by anyone for any purpose outside the state apparatus, and in a way it also demonizes, stigmatizes the people who use violence for any kind of purpose, any particular kind of objective. So the term will be treated something like the rapist or the murderers. So terrorism is a highly pejorative term in the sense that like the murderers, like the rapists in the society, the terrorists are equated with that kind of stigmatization, and when a person is stigmatized, what happens with that person, what happens to the future of that person, you can easily imagine. The term is also used selectively as a political weapon, implying that they are the enemy of the civil society and they are intent on causing death, destruction and fear for their own sake and not for larger political purpose, unlike the freedom fighters and revolutionaries. So this is how you can distinguish the terrorists from freedom fighters and revolutionaries, because the freedom fighters and revolutionaries, they are inspired for a larger cause, they are working for a larger cause, but the terrorists, they have always a narrow agenda or sometimes a sectarian agenda. While terrorism is often portrayed as an anti-government activity, government may also employ terror against their own people or the population of other countries. So, in that case, we can call it as state terrorism or state sponsored terrorism. Let us now discuss about the core elements of terrorism, because if there is no agreed definition of terrorism, then at least we can identify some of the core elements that is common to all the definitions of terrorism. So, we may not agree whether a particular event is terrorism or not, but in order to study it, we have to set out some of the fundamental characteristics of terrorism. Faced with the need to define the phenomena of terrorism, it is useful to focus on 5 core elements found common in virtually all definitions of terrorism. They cover violence, political objectives, actors, audience and victims. Let us now explain each one of them. First, there must be the threat or use of violence. People can engage in outrageous actions, but unless they are involved in violence or threat of violence, they are not terrorism. So, use of violence, or even if it is symbolic use of violence, that is a must for categorizing a particular kind of activity as terrorist activity. So, if there is no violence, so it cannot be called as terrorism. In that sense, terrorists may be distinguished from ordinary criminals, because sometimes the criminals may or may not use violence, but terrorists, in order to be called as terrorists or in order to be understood as terrorists, should use violence, and that is a must for distinguishing terrorist activities from other criminal activities. Second, terrorism has a political objective. People who justify their use of terrorism always claim that they are being altruistic, meaning that they are seeking a better life for those on whose behalf they are actually fighting. So, that is the second objective, that the terrorists never claim that they are doing that for their own, rather they will claim that whatever they are doing for their particular kind of people or particular group of people. Third, though states engage in many kinds of dreadful violence that are also inherently political, non-state actors carry out terrorism. So, this is actually a point of difference between different scholars of international relations, because some consider terrorism as something carried out by the non-state actors, and other considers there is no distinction between state terrorism and non-state terrorism. Anyone who uses violent methods, so he or she can be categorized as a terrorist, even if it is state actors. Third, though states engage in many kinds of dreadful violence that are also inherently political, non-state actors actually carry out terrorism. So, this is actually a major point of difference between many schools in international relations, whether terrorism should be exclusively identified with non-state actors or state actors should also be included in that category. Scholars speak of terror from above to refer the state use of violence, and terrorism from below to refer to terrorism by non-state actors. So, this kind of categorization is there, that terror from above means state terrorism, and terror from below means terrorism carried out by the non-state actors. Although there is an extended vocabulary to condemn bad state actions, but state violence is considered as legitimate violence not associated with terrorism. For this reason, the study of terrorism generally focuses on non-state actors. So, because state has the legitimate authority to use coercive instruments of violence against any group or group of persons or any entity within the domestic jurisdiction of the state or within the sovereign authority of the state. So, state use of violence is not considered as terrorist action, and it is widely understood that non-state actors actually use violent methods, and that use of violence by the non-state actors is considered as terrorist acts. Others, however, make a distinction between state's legitimate use of violence employed to protect its citizens and illegitimately targeting certain individuals or groups in order to instill fear in the target audience beyond the direct victim. So, the point is, there can be a distinction between state's legitimate use of violence and illegitimate use of violence, and when the state is indulged in the illegitimate use of violence, that can be categorized as state terrorism. States also sponsor terrorism when a terrorist group receives support in the form of funding, training, supply of weapons, shelter within its borders, as well as other ways of logistical and intelligence assistance. So, this is a typical example of state sponsored terrorism or cross border terrorism, and Pakistan is equated with this kind of terrorism against India. The fourth key element is the audience. Terrorism uses random violence to maximize psychological shock and have an effect upon an audience to intimidate, outrage or inspire who could be the relative of the victims, potential recruits or a range of other audiences. So, without audiences, without publicity, so publicity is sometimes considered as the oxygen for terrorism. So, without the audience, terrorist acts have no meaning, no objective. So, in order to magnify their impact, in order to leverage their impact, they always target the audience, and this audience can be their sympathizers, they can be their future recruiters, and they can also be the relatives of the victims who could influence the government, who could pressurize the government for accepting the demands of the terrorists. So, this is also an important element of terrorism. Finally, terrorism deliberately targets civilians or non-combatants. It is a violence intentionally directed against people who are generally considered to be defenseless. Therefore, illegitimate targets always violating international norms. As per the international law, there is a distinction between combatants and non-combatants, and those who use violence for any legitimate purpose can use force against the combatants, but they have no right to use violence against non-combatants, in which children, women and elderly people, or those who are civilians not involved in any kind of organized kind of violence, they should not be targeted. So, but terrorists do not make any kind of distinction, and in fact they always target the defenseless people, or their target is always illegitimate, and that is how terrorists do not obey or they do not respect international norms or international law. So, at its core, terrorism has 5 elements: violence, political objectives, state actors or non-state actors perpetrators, an audience and illegitimate targets. So, in the absence of any agreed definition of terrorism, we could use these core elements to understand terrorism in international relations. In a nutshell, terrorism is the use or threat of use of violence or symbolic violence by both state and non-state actors against combatants and non-combatants for political objectives. So, once we identify the core elements of terrorism, it becomes easy for us to have a proper understanding of the issue of terrorism, that those who use violence, even if it is symbolic, and this violence is used not just by the state actors but non-state actors also, and against the combatants and even non-combatants for political objectives. So, if you cover all the elements of terrorism, that helps us to have a proper understanding of the issue of terrorism. Let us now discuss about the typologies of terrorism. Terrorist organizations operating around the world may be categorized by one of the 4 major political motivations. So, on the basis of their political motivations, we can have 4 types of terrorism. They are the left-wing terrorism, the right-wing terrorism, ethno-nationalistic or separatist terrorism, and religious or sacred terrorism. Each motivation is intertwined with major ideologies, with the left-wing terrorism associated with Marxism or communism. The right-wing terrorism is associated with fascism. The ethno-nationalist or separatist terrorism is associated with national or ethnic identity, and the religious terrorism is always associated with spiritual beliefs. These categories of terrorism are, however, not mutually exclusive. Rather, they sometimes you may find terrorist organization combining 2 kind of motivations. For example, Hamas in Palestine is both a religious and ethno-nationalist terrorist group. Thinking about them helps us to see the global trends and the relationship that exist between different violent groups. Using a different explanation, David C. Rappaport in his article The Four Waves of Modern Terrorism argues that anti-state or rebel terrorism tend to occur in 40-year waves shaped by predominantly ideological energy. He distinguishes four kinds of terrorists particularly on the basis of their ideological energy, and they are the anarchist from 1880 to 1920, the anti-colonialist from 1920 to 1960, the new left from 1960 to 1980, and the religious radicalism from 1979 onwards. He argues that academics and governments unduly focus on specific organizations and contemporary events, but understanding the overarching global and generational patterns in real time can help shape our thinking and the most effective ways to combat international terrorism. So, these four types of terrorists, maybe their motivation is different from each other, but we must remember that sometimes these types of terrorists or these types of terrorism are not mutually exclusive, rather they are inspired by the other variety, they have a close connection with the other variety, and they influence each other in a substantial way. Let us now focus on the strategies used by the terrorist. Throughout the history, terrorist groups have used four basic strategies of terrorism, sometimes in combination and sometimes separately. To understand them, we must remember that there are three elements of any terrorist attack: the attacker, the target, and the audience. So, once we accept that these three elements are there, then it becomes easy for us to understand different kinds of strategies used by the terrorist. The first is called compellence, which means the use of threats to influence another actor to stop doing something or to start doing something else. So, this is basically called in international politics as relational power. So, you have the power if you influence or the other is influenced to act in a way that you want or not act in a way that you do not want. In international politics, we call it as relational power. When A has power over B, if B does something which the A wants or B does not do something which the A does not want. The second important strategy used by the terrorist is what is called leverage. There are three sides of terrorism: the group, the target, and the various audiences who are actually watching the act. If the goal of an attack is to change the shape, size, or attitude of an audience, then the target is not a direct end in itself, but an indirect means to affect something else. That is the strategy of leverage, which can be classified into three types. The first strategy of leverage is what is called provocation, which tries to force a state to react or to do something, not a specific kind of policy formulation, but an overreaction that may alienate the people that it is supposed to protect. So, this provocation is a very popular strategy used by the terrorists, because if they provoke you to do something which you should not have done, that in a way alienates your own population, and over a long period of time you also lose legitimacy in the eyes of your own population. So, this provocation is a very dangerous strategy used by the terrorists against the state actors. The next strategy is called polarization, the use of terrorist attack to divide the population and delegitimize the governments so that they cannot govern in the long run. It is basically used as a strategy against the democratic countries, because if you polarize the people, if you divide the people, then in the long term you lose your claim to rule over your own people. So, this is also a very popular strategy used by the terrorists, but nowadays even politicians they try to polarize their own people. The last is mobilization, through which terrorists try to rally their supporters to their cause. Terrorist attacks are meant to attract recruits and raise the profile of the group internationally, drawing thereby resources, sympathizers, and allies. So if your profile is not good, if nobody knows you, then it becomes difficult for you to generate resources, or you get maximum number of sympathizers or even allies. So you, in order to be respected by others, in order to be accepted by others, in order to be known by others, you should carry out some daredevil type of acts, and that is how you can generate resources, allies and sympathizers. Understanding exactly what a group is actually trying to do is the only way to end the terrorist violence. So unless and until we understand their strategies, it is very difficult to devise a right kind of counter-terrorism method. Sometimes terrorist groups use more than one approach, but there is no substitute for doing serious, in-depth kind of homework about their goals, techniques and constituencies. So it is very difficult to deal with terrorism, because they do not use any one kind of method. They use different kinds of methods. They try to polarize the people. They don't use a single strategy, rather use a combination of strategies. So unless and until we understand their goal, we understand their techniques and their constituencies, so it is really difficult to deal with the problem of terrorism. Governments that fail to consider them sometimes take short-term actions that make sense from the two-sided standpoint of compellence, but play into the hands of the terrorist groups using indirect three-sided strategies of provocation, polarization or mobilization instead. Sometimes the government becomes impulsive and use compellence as a strategy to deal with terrorism. But if the government uses compellence without looking to other factors, then there is a risk that it may help the terrorists to use the other strategies against it, that is provocation, polarization and mobilization. So compellence is not the only strategy, or it should not be the first strategy used by any state or government against the terrorists. Rather, whenever you use compellence strategy against the terrorists, you should also think seriously about the other objectives of the terrorists. That is, it may be that they are provoking you, or they want to polarize you, or they want to use mobilization as a strategy against a particular state or government. So in order to deal with the problem of terrorism, we need to have a serious thought about all these four strategies of terrorism. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. There are three main approaches to understand terrorism: realism, liberalism and critical perspectives. States undertake various counter-terrorism strategies such as strengthening the state security, military repression, political dialogue and autonomy deals, social and economic development policies, and diplomatic isolation of the countries sponsoring terrorism. The 9/11 attacks on the United States galvanized American counterterrorism response in four different waves. The first was the war against terror in Afghanistan. The second was the invasion of Iraq. The third was the establishment of a separate Department of Homeland Security. And finally, the strengthening of global counterterrorism cooperation by the United States. Other consequences included blurring the lines between war, terror, and human rights, permanent negative societal effects, growth of surveillance technology, increasing use of drone technology, changes in the interpretation of international law and state practices on the use of force, and increasing multilateral cooperation in combating global terrorism. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you once again.